For decades, Disney sold magic as if it lived in the walls. Then one quiet morning, a studio executive saw a new name climbing the shareholder list and realized the castle had a price tag. Phones lit up. Lawyers got pulled into meetings. Someone from New York wanted the whole company. And inside Burbank, people started asking who would get thrown overboard first. "Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it." From the outside, Disney looked untouchable. A brand parents trusted. Characters everyone recognized. Theme parks that printed cash on weekends. But the company only looked soft. Under the paint, it was a machine. It ran on pipelines. Story rooms feeding animation units. Music deadlines. Merch licensing calendars. Park operations that cared about throughput and staffing like a factory floor. If the public saw wonder, the company saw scheduling. That's why magic mattered so much. It wasn't a vibe. It was the wrapper that kept the machine protected. Walt Disney built that wrapper with absolute control. Inside the studio, people learned quickly that Walt's taste wasn't a suggestion. It was law. Some former employees later described a culture where one wrong note could end your momentum. Others claimed he kept mental lists of who was loyal and who wasn't. Those are stories, not documents, but they fit the pattern of a founder who hated chaos. And when the studio was threatened, Walt could turn cold. The 1941 animators' strike proved that. The public saw a labor dispute. Inside the company, it felt like betrayal. Later accounts from people around that era suggested Walt never truly forgave it, even after the gates reopened. Whether every detail is true or not, the strike left a scar that taught Disney leadership one lesson. If control slips, everything slips. Then Walt died, and the company kept smiling anyway. The castle still stood. The characters still sold. But now the machine had to run, without the one man who could force an answer by walking into a room. Committees took over. Meetings got slower. Decisions got safer. And that kind of safety can rot a company quietly. That's when the internal whispers started changing tone. Not rumors about creativity, rumors about complacency, about executives protecting positions, about the studio living on its past while the stock sat there like a bargain. People on the lot could feel the difference between a kingdom led by a founder and a kingdom led by caretakers. A caretaker doesn't build. A caretaker defends. Wall Street notices that faster than fans do. To a raider, Disney wasn't a storybook. It was undervalued real estate, a global brand, and cash flow from parks and licensing. It was a vault with a friendly face on the door. If the leadership looked slow, the company looked vulnerable. And vulnerability attracts a certain type of visitor. Not the kind who cares about animation. The kind who buys a steak quietly, then calls the board and says the word that makes executives stop breathing: takeover. Inside Burbank, you could feel the mood flip. The studio lot still had sound stages and character statues, but the conversations got sharper. People started watching who went into which office, who was suddenly meeting with bankers, who was staying late with counsel. Rumors love moments like this. Some said executives were leaking to the press to position themselves as saviors. Others claimed certain board members were already shopping for a deal, privately, while publicly insisting everything was fine. You can't prove whispers, but you can measure what they do. They make everyone act like they're being watched. Because in a power war, the first casualty is trust. And once a company like Disney starts operating on suspicion, magic doesn't vanish on a headline. It dies in conference rooms. It dies when people stop saying what they really think. It dies when the brand becomes a bargaining chip. That morning, with the shareholder list changing and the phone lines burning, Disney's leadership understood the threat in plain terms. This wasn't criticism. This was a raid. And raids don't end with applause. They end with someone losing a throne. The takeover threat didn't start with a hostile speech. It started with paperwork that arrived like a draft under the door. On the Disney lot, people still talked about movies and park attendance. Then a staffer in finance saw the shareholder list updating and felt his stomach drop. A name from New York was buying in. Not a fan. Not a partner. A man whose business was turning companies into numbers. This was the early 1980s, when corporate raiders weren't a theory. They were a weather system. They'd find a famous brand, buy a stake quietly, and then call the board with a simple message. You can sell to me, or I can take it. Disney looked like the last place that could happen. But inside, the company wasn't running on magic. It was running on a caretaker structure that moved slowly, argued politely, and assumed time was always available. After Walt, the kingdom had no king. It had committees. Executives like Cardwalker and Ron Miller were trying to hold the brand steady without breaking it. Some decisions were smart, some were defensive, and every defensive decision feeds the same perception on Wall Street. This company is precious, but it's drifting. That drift showed up in the studio first. There were bright experiments, but also expensive swings that didn't land the way the company needed. The lot didn't feel dead. It felt cautious, a place protecting a legacy instead of hunting a future. When a company lives on its past, the stock price starts looking like a bargain to people who don't care about the past. And there was another problem nobody liked saying out loud: family politics. Ron Miller was Walt's son-in-law, and even if he earned his seat, whispers followed him anyway. Some employees later claimed the hallways felt split between the family and the professionals. Others claimed certain executives acted untouchable because the name Disney was literally at the table with them. Whether those rumors were fair or not, they created exactly what raiders love: division. Because a divided board is easier to pressure. A divided company is easier to scare. Then the pressure got a face. Saul Steinberg was not a Hollywood type. He was a corporate predator with a reputation for seeing soft targets. The kind of man who doesn't need to run your company forever. He only needs enough leverage to force a payout or a sale. Inside Burbank, the first calls didn't sound like war. They sounded like interest. The tone was friendly. The content wasn't. A stake was forming. More shares could be bought. Options existed. Discussions could happen privately, which is another way of saying in a room where the company can't control the story. The board started meeting more often. Not the normal calendar meetings. Emergency meetings. Lawyers were brought in. Investment bankers were consulted. People who had spent their careers building family entertainment were suddenly learning the vocabulary of corporate survival. Tender offers, proxy fights, white knights, poison pills. Words that feel like weapons because they are. And the lot changed. When a company senses a raid, it becomes paranoid fast. Someone leaks a memo, and everyone starts looking for the leak. Someone speaks to a reporter, and suddenly every conversation sounds like strategy. Rumors spread that phones were being watched, that assistants were asked to report who met with whom, that certain executives were keeping side channels open with New York just in case. You can't prove most of those whispers, but you can see what they do. They make people stop trusting the building. At the same time, the public image stayed clean. Characters smiled. Park ads ran. The company talked like nothing was happening. That's the strangest part of a Disney power war. The outside world sees fireworks. Inside, it's men in suits calculating who might lose everything. And the most dangerous moment wasn't Steinberg buying shares. It was what Disney's own people began doing in response. Because once you start defending against a takeover, you have to pick a strategy. You fight, you pay, or you make a deal that saves the company but changes what it is. And inside Disney, not everyone wanted the same outcome. Some wanted to protect the legacy at any cost. Some wanted to protect their jobs. Some quietly wondered if a takeover would finally remove the people they hated. That's when Roy E. Disney becomes impossible to ignore. Roy wasn't just a relative. He carried the family name like a weapon, and he hated what the company was becoming. He believed the caretakers were letting the brand weaken until New York could buy it. And once Roy decided that, the war stopped being Disney versus a raider. It became Disney versus itself. The moment Roy E. Disney turned against his own company, the lot got quieter. Not because people stopped working, because everyone started listening differently. When the founder's nephew walks away from the board and says leadership is putting the legacy at risk, that isn't an internal memo. That's a flare shot into the sky. Roy had been inside the building long enough to know where the soft spots were. He knew which executives were protected. He knew which projects were bleeding cash. He knew how easily the Disney name could be used as armor while the company drifted. And once Steinberg's stake became the talk of the hallways, Roy decided the real danger wasn't only the raider. It was the caretakers who looked beatable. Ron Miller tried to hold the line like a CEO under siege. He didn't just worry about movies and parks. He worried about the stock price. Because in this kind of war, the share price is a door lock. If the lock looks weak, someone tries the handle. So the defense started looking like a fence. Disney began making moves that felt strange for a magic company. Real estate, financial reshuffling, deals that weren't about stories or characters, but about making the balance sheet harder to swallow. The idea was simple. If a raider wants to buy us, make us expensive and messy. Inside Burbank, people read those moves as panic. Rumors spread that bankers were now in rooms where writers used to be, that legal teams were reading contracts like scripts, looking for weak scenes, that assistants were being asked who met with which reporter. None of it needed to be proven to do its job. It made everyone feel like the building had eyes. Steinberg pushed harder as the confusion grew. He didn't need to storm the gates. He could just keep accumulating influence and let fear do the rest. Calls went out. Meetings happened off-site. The tone stayed polite, but the message tightened. Seats on the board, leverage over strategy, a say in what the castle is worth. That's when Roy and his allies started doing what Disney had always been best at. They made it a story. They painted Miller's leadership as drift. They framed the board as complacent. They pushed the idea that the company wasn't being attacked only from the outside. It was being weakened from the inside. People later described it as a civil war, where each side claimed to be saving Disney, just saving it from different enemies. And the dirty part was how personal it got. Whispers ran through the lot that old grudges were being cashed in, that executives were quietly feeding information to journalists to set up rivals, that certain names were being floated as replacements while the current leadership was still sitting in the chair. In takeover season, reputations become currency, and Disney had a lot of reputations to spend. By now, the employees could feel the shift in the company's soul. You can work at Disney and still believe in the brand. But when the boardroom turns into a battlefield, the brand becomes a shield, not a mission. People stop asking, "What's the next great film?" and start asking, "Who's still going to be here next month?" And that's the exact moment magic starts to crack. Not on screen, on the org chart. Because a raider doesn't need to destroy Disney to win. He only needs Disney to start acting like it can be owned. A raider doesn't have to storm the gates. He only has to prove the gates can be bought. Once Steinberg's position became real leverage, Disney's board started acting like a crew on a leaking ship. The meetings got smaller. The rooms got quieter. People stopped taking notes in the open. When a company feels hunted, everyone becomes careful with words. Then the defense turned ugly in the way Wall Street understands best. Not a heroic speech, a cash move, a deal designed to make the attacker go away before the brand gets publicly priced like scrap. Inside those negotiations, Disney wasn't selling movies. It was selling time. One more week without a takeover headline. One more month to find a friendly ally. One more chance to keep the parks open while the boardroom burned. And when the numbers got thrown on the table, the illusion cracked. Disney's magic wasn't the castle. It was the balance sheet. If you could write a check big enough, you could make the threat disappear. People on the lot didn't see the check. They felt what it meant. Because the moment you pay an attacker to leave, you teach the market something brutal. This company can be pressured. This company will pay. And that attracts the next predator. Roy E. Disney and his allies treated that like proof of failure. They argued that the caretakers had turned Disney into prey. They weren't just fighting Steinberg anymore. They were fighting the leadership that let Steinberg get close enough to name a price. And the personal dirt started surfacing like it always does in a coup. Whispers ran that certain executives had protected their friends for years, that deals were being steered, that the studio was run like a club, not a battlefield-ready company. Rumors about Ron Miller's family protection followed him everywhere, whether fair or not, because in a takeover fight, perception is a weapon. Even Walt's shadow got dragged back into the room. Old stories resurfaced in the press and in the hallways. The 1941 strike. The bitterness. The alleged blacklists. The old myth that Walt was frozen somewhere, like a punchline people used when they wanted to say the company was living in the past. None of that moved the stock price directly, but it poisoned the mood. It reminded everyone that Disney had always been harder inside than it looked outside. Then the board hit the decision it had been delaying. Ron Miller was out. Not because one film failed, not because the parks stopped printing cash, because the takeover threat exposed what everyone already suspected. The leadership didn't look feared. It looked manageable. And in this era, a CEO who looks manageable gets eaten. Now the search began, and it felt like a casting call for control. Roy and his partner Stanley Gold pushed hard for a new regime. Bankers started floating names like they were auditions. Michael Eisner came up. Frank Wells came up. People who could sell confidence to Wall Street while keeping the brand intact for families. On the lot, the fear turned into a different kind of silence. Employees watched limousines arrive. They watched unfamiliar suits walk through the gates. They watched executives smile too tightly in hallways. and they understood the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Disney wasn't choosing a leader to make better movies. Disney was choosing a leader to survive. The search for a new regime moved faster than any creative decision Disney had made in years. Bankers didn't talk about characters. They talked about defense. How to stop Steinberg from coming back tomorrow with a bigger stake. How to raise the stock price so the company stopped looking cheap. How to make the board look dangerous enough that Wall Street picked another target. That's when the magic got collateralized. Disney started looking for a white knight, the kind that doesn't wear armor. It wears a tailored suit and buys enough shares to change the math. The Bass family of Texas was brought in as a stabilizing force, an emergency block of ownership that could keep a raider from getting control just by accumulating stock quietly. And then Disney did the move that makes everyone feel sick afterward, even if it works. They paid the threat to leave, not with a public confession. With a buyback at a premium, the corporate version of paying someone to stop circling your house. Employees didn't see the term sheets, but they felt the message. If the pressure is hard enough, the company will write a check to survive. That isn't a defeat on paper, but it changes how predators see you. Inside Burbank, it also changed how people saw leadership. Rumors ran through the lot that the deal was pushed through with a kind of panic you don't expect from a company built on confidence. Whispers that certain directors were screaming behind closed doors, then smiling in front of cameras. Whispers that leaks were being fed to columnists to scare one side into moving faster. Nobody could pin it down cleanly, but the atmosphere told you the truth. The building didn't feel enchanted anymore. It felt hunted. Roy E. Disney and Stanley Gold used that moment like a wedge. They argued that the caretakers had proven they couldn't protect the kingdom. And now there was an opening to install leaders who could. The names that surfaced weren't artists. They were operators. Michael Eisner was a television and film executive with a reputation for speed and control. Frank Wells came from a different world, corporate and disciplined, the kind of man who could calm a boardroom while someone else threw punches. The pitch was simple. One sells vision and momentum. One sells stability and structure. When the deal finally came together, it didn't feel like a coronation. It felt like a takeover from inside. Ron Miller was gone. The new team arrived, and everyone on the lot understood what that meant in practice. New people bring new loyalty chains. New loyalty chains bring clean outs. The question wasn't whether heads would roll. The question was whose. More rumors followed because Disney was Disney, and it always attracts myth. Some said the old guard tried to sabotage the transition by leaking embarrassing stories. Others claimed the new camp had their own file folders ready, full of mistakes and quiet scandals they could weaponize if anyone resisted. There were always whispers about the founder, too, about what Walt would have done, about old grudges and old sins, because in a power war, people drag ghosts into the room to win arguments. But the reality was harder and simpler. The company had survived the raid, and it had done it by turning itself into a more modern corporate weapon. That meant sharper leadership, tighter control, more attention to numbers, and less patience for the slow, protective culture that had kept Disney safe but exposed. The day-to-day feel began to change fast. Meetings became shorter. Decisions became more direct. People started hearing phrases that didn't belong in a fairy tale. Market position, synergy, shareholder confidence. The studio still made entertainment, but now it did it with the awareness that the next threat might not come from a critic. it might come from a spreadsheet. That's the turning point. Disney didn't lose its characters, its parks, or its brand. It lost its innocence about what it was. It learned, in public, that the castle can be appraised, bought, and pressured like any other asset. And once you learn that, you never walk through the gates the same way again. After the emergency deals, Disney didn't feel rescued. It felt redesigned under pressure. The raider was pushed back, the bass stake stiffened the defenses, and the board could finally breathe without checking the stock ticker every 10 minutes. But breathing isn't the same as healing. Everyone inside the company knew what had just happened. A brand built on wonder had been forced to negotiate like a cornered industrial firm. Michael Eisner and Frank Wells arrived like a new operating system. Eisner brought speed and appetite. Wells brought structure and calm. Together, they made Disney look strong again to the outside world, which is exactly what the company needed after being publicly smelled as prey. But the internal shock didn't vanish. It just changed shape. Because survival has a price, and at Disney, the price was the old culture. Meetings got shorter, power centralized. People who had grown comfortable under the caretakers suddenly found themselves measured by a colder standard. Results, optics, control. Some people called it modernization. Others called it a purge with better lighting. Either way, the lot felt different when the new regime started making decisions the old one would have debated for months. Roy E. Disney and Stanley Gold had gotten what they wanted. The drift was over. But that didn't mean the war ended cleanly. It meant the war moved into reputation and positioning. Whispers kept running through the corridors because Disney is the kind of place where myths breed easily. Some gossip claimed old executives tried to plant stories to embarrass the new leadership. Other gossip claimed the new camp had its own quiet files ready, the kind you keep when you expect internal resistance. There were also the usual Hollywood rumors that flare up whenever power changes hands. Hints of backroom favors, private blow-ups, people drinking too hard, people being protected until they weren't. None of it ever came with proof that employees could hold in their hands. But the effect was real. People started treating their careers like a chessboard. And the founder's shadow never stopped being useful as a weapon. When the company needed unity, people invoked Walt like a saint. When they needed to attack, they invoked Walt like a judge. Old stories were dragged out to argue anything: that Disney should be gentler, or that Disney had always been ruthless behind the curtain. The truth is, both can be true. A machine can make dreams and still be built on control. That's the irreversible moment in this story. The company didn't lose its characters. It didn't stop making families happy. The parks didn't turn into ruins. What changed was internal belief. Disney learned, publicly, that magic is also an asset, something that can be priced, leveraged, defended, and nearly taken. You can feel that change in one very simple scene. It's late, the studio lot is quieter than it looks on postcards. A few office lights are still on. Security does its rounds. The character statues and themed signs are still there, smiling like they always did. But inside the offices, the language is different now. Not just storyboards and songs. Defenses, shareholder confidence, control of narrative. You can't go through a siege and keep pretending you're immune to the world that profits from siege. Disney survived by becoming harder. And that's why people inside the company remembered this era the way they did. Not as a headline, but as a shift you could feel in the building. The day everyone realized the castle isn't a castle. It's a target that has to be defended like any other. Like the video, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from? This is where we follow famous empires through the moments they stop being innocent. If you watched the video to the end, did Disney's magic feel different after you heard how close it came to being bought?